How's it going, everyone? Thank you for joining me on a new episode of the Music Reviewer Podcast. My name's Josh, and yeah, today we're doing an album review, our 50th episode of the album review series. So, yeah, it's honestly, it's doesn't feel like I've done 50 of these, but yeah. Today, the album we're covering is Little Oblivions by the artist Julien Baker. The album was released on February 26th, so roughly a bit under a month ago. But fits into a month's time frame for the limit I give myself to do these reviews. So anyways, thanks for tuning in today. If you're new to the Music Reviewer Podcast, welcome. My name's Josh. I just like to talk about music, and I do album reviews and stuff on this podcast. And just to update everyone, a new episode of Best Winners Track of the Week dropped not too long ago for the week of March 13th. So if you're interested on some more pop and like contemporary hits, track reviews and stuff like that, it's a weekly segment I do. Best track ended up being by Pop Smoke, and the worst track ended up being by an artist called Dylan Scott. A lot of country on that episode, very country centric. So if that's not your cup of tea, I don't blame you. And then also the last album review we did was the Django album, Glowing in the Dark. Kind of think that one's kind of running under the radar. I feel like these somewhat prominent indie and like alt-rock bands from the 2010s are are getting a bit buried, or they're just not getting as much attention. Sometimes understandably, but I thought Django's latest effort was pretty solid. If you want some of my thoughts on that album, go ahead and check out that episode. Also check out the album. Like I said, pretty solid effort. And then also, I don't even know if I was even planning on reviewing it, but I might now. I didn't even realize there is a new Group Love album out. So it kind of fits into like those 2010s indie alt-rock bands that are kind of just like not super, prominent anymore. I don't know if that's just I don't really pay as much attention. I probably don't, but kind of went off on a tangent there. But that's kind of just what's going on the podcast recently. I'm trying to push out more album reviews, but like I said, let's go ahead and get into this Julien Baker album, Little Oblivions. You said this is episode 15. A little bit about Julien Baker. She's an American singer-songwriter and instrumentalist. I think she's I don't know what she's proficient on technically, but the times I've seen what she does live, like on YouTube or something, she plays like piano and guitar. Wouldn't be surprised if she could do some, bass in there too. And then maybe, who knows, drums. But yeah, it seems like a pretty talented artist overall. Very stunning voice at times. Over the past few years, she has drawn some critical acclaim. And had some spotlight on her in the indie blogosphere. And she's also known for being like 1/3 of the supergroup Boy Genius, which features Lucy Dacus or Dacus, I don't know how to say her name correctly, and of the now very well known Phoebe Bridgers. A couple of years ago, they released a very good album with much critical acclaim as well. Kind of like at the height of the Me Too movement. So the group's formation maybe coincided with that, but the Julien Baker is 1/3 of that group, and I guess like Julien's music maybe is a bit of the outlier with how the other two artists sound when they come together for Boy Genius. That the music's pretty decent, but yeah, Julien. If I had to say. If Phoebe Bridgers or Lucy Dacus is more accessible, I guess to a certain audience, I'd have to say, yeah, they are. Julien kind of really has her own unique style, and it doesn't really pop up, in my opinion, that much on the stuff that we hear when she's playing in the context of Boy Genius. And I don't know really if that matters too much. But according to Wikipedia, Baker grew up in a suburb right outside of Memphis. Her early exposure to music beginning in the church that she went to, like so many other countless musicians. It appears that Julien was inspired by alt-rock bands of the 2000s, like Green Day, Death Cab for Cutie, which is you can kind of hear that influence in a bit of her work, especially on this album and My Chemical Romance, stuff like that. Honestly, not far off from countless other teens and kids around that time, myself included. I think Julie and I are roughly a year apart. She later has referenced punk and hardcore bands to be quite influential as well. I don't really think that sound really turns up at all in her music as a solo artist. She was in some bands earlier on, I guess, in her teens. And then even, interestingly enough, straight edge punk as well to help her through, I guess, a bout of drug abuse. Interestingly, Julien went to college as well and picked up some audio engineering skills there. That's what she intended to go to school for. And she eventually ended up releasing her debut solo music around that time and dropped out of college to pursue touring behind her debut album, which she released. But also respectively noted that she eventually went back to school in 2019, according to Wikipedia, to complete her degree, which I think is pretty cool, that she can balance the two things. I know I probably couldn't. But anyways, going back to her previous album, honestly, I have been following Julien Baker for a few years. Don't really know. I honestly, my problem with Julien Baker is that I can't really, I can never really pick out from a lineup, a distinct song most of the time. A lot of her tracks sound very blended and homogenous track to track. So it's a very cool, unique style that works. But honestly, I couldn't really hum you a Julien Baker tune or being like, oh, that Julien Baker track slaps on this album. I haven't been able to get into Julien Baker to that extent. And to prepare for the review, I went back to her last album, Turn Out the Lights, coming out like maybe in 2017, I think, or like 18. I remember around that time I was aware of her, and I probably did listen to this album. But coming back, just some notes here. I guess the opening track, Over, starts in a very similar vein with like some string instrumentation that opens up also interestingly Little Oblivions. But I will say Over utilizes those strings in a much more impactful way that made a bit more sense with how it bled into the gist of the track so naturally. And I can't really say that fluidity or smoothness happens on Hardline. The strings are a bit abrupt. I'll get to that later. Tracks like Turn Out the Lights were pretty impactful, I'd say, but the climatic moments towards the end of the track can sound a bit overblown and abrasive with how loud everything is being pushed overall. And while listening to this, I kind of just came to the realization that Julien is the kind of artist that is certainly given praise for being talented in many facets, songwriting, vocal chops. She's a pretty good instrumentalist as well. She truly is obviously extremely talented. I just feel like I couldn't really come away with many moments or songs that were that memorable on this project. Kind of like I was going through in general with her discography. Every track just feels like it's very similar or just features very similar ideas that are just tweaked a bit. Tweaked in the sense that it's only really unique to Julien, but the end product just has me wishing she were utilizing her talents with more dynamics and maybe some flair track to track. For example, the track Even, it was a breath of fresh air on this album with its eighth note strumming on the acoustic guitar. It goes against the typical piano-centric nature of the album, coated with her morose vocal presence, like what we find on the closing track, Claws in Your Back. And none of this is bad per se. It's just a bit static and a bit predictable at the end of the day. And I guess what we get on this new album, Little Oblivions, is a bit of a left turn, honestly, from like her typical style. She does experiment a bit more, plays around with more texture, different songwriting from track to track. There's some stuff that feels a little bit more accessible and maybe more, radio friendly. But she kind of still holds true to the piano-centric, singer-songwriter, vocal-centric style that she, obviously is her bread and butter. Hardline, the opening track here, I will say is a bit of an outlier in respect to the rest of the album, I think. It felt like it could have been more fitting as a closer. This track really confused me a bit. It opens up with some harsh synthy string work. The track aims to have like these huge sounding instrumental breakdowns that can feel a bit overblown with all the synths turned up on the climatic sections. But I will say it does create a nice contrast with when the softer moments do appear in the beginning of the track, in comparison to the more dominant, louder sections that come about. But the end result with these blown out synthy strings returning isn't very flattering. It can feel a bit abrasive or I guess just harsh. I will say the next track on the next song, Heatwave, is a bit of a highlight. I love the rustic folk-like nature of the track. I will say this is probably a track that is good for pointing out some experimentation in our overall discography, I think. Kind of reminded me of like the sort of style and flair that an artist like Kurt Weill could bring to this stuff. She kind of was able to bring that here. Julien definitely changed up some things, and it ended up working here. More of like this straightforward indie pop with alternative sound. I love the build-up section in the bridge as well. There's some dry guitar There are some dry guitar textures that fit the track very nicely. And it's a nice solid track. Honestly, I wish the album really went for more of this sort of thing. And then the next track, Faith Healer, didn't really think too much of it other than the introduction sounds something typical of Kings of Leon. I just, I've been listening to their latest album that just dropped, with, some typical bright, plucked, ostinato guitar melodies. That's all over like stuff that Kings of Leon does. She kind of takes that here. Wouldn't be surprised if they're one of her influences. But other than that, the track just felt a bit incomplete and open-ended by the time it ended. Relative Fiction, I thought was, it went back to like the slow and simmering nature. I think it's one of the lead singles if I had to really go back and remember the first tracks I was hearing earlier this year or last year. I've definitely heard it before. For some reason, Julien's voice sounds a lot huskier on this album. This track really exemplifies that. And the vocal can feel a bit static when she goes about this route, something that usually isn't the case in Julien's music. It's an interesting track, but it just felt a bit lukewarm. Next track, Crying Wolf, has some much needed soft and rich texture in comparison to the rest of the album. The piano's nice, the sensitive organ bits I dig. The track just sounds a bit more spaced out and not as cluttered, I guess. And that sound really gives a great foundation for Julien to have a more dynamic and effective performance, and it works here. Probably the best track thus far, if I had to say. And the track probably has some derivative soft rock sensibility, if I had to really go there, but it's not bad. It works. Didn't really think too much of the next track, Bloodshot. We didn't really get much of a highlight until the next track, Ringside. The track kind of just has some pop country flavor to it, Maren Morris-like, if you will, or something like that. So more of like some rustic folk, but I think this leans more on like country. I like the crispy guitar track that guides everything with the eighth note pulse. The track flows nicely, more than most tracks on the album. There's some actual energy that happens naturally. I will say that's hard to come by at points in this album. And I dig the softer bridge section on this track that leads into like this outro, which is basically a nice vibrant instrumental interlude. Kind of reminds me of some material that maybe Coldplay was making at some point, or if you really want to go there, Keane, another British, alt-rock band. Next track, Favor, thought it was a pretty good track. It really reminded me of like some old school emo indie stuff like Pinback or maybe like old Death Cab for Cutie. I really like this aesthetic that Julien creates here. It kind of suits her well with this washed vocal effect and the color it brings to the track. And I kind of wish on this track the drum track hung around more than it actually did. It's a strong point of the album. And there's this, pretty cool feature of some hazy brass instrumentation, a nice build up on that bridge, and one of the more exciting moments on the album overall, and then one of the better tracks. So yeah, Favor, definitely a highlight. Song in E kind of leans on a more piano-centric singer-songwriter style that's typical of Julian. Her voice really shines on here. I dig the natural rasp that she's able to produce. Pretty much done as expected, though. The piano is vibrant and pretty at times on this track. It's not bad, but it's also not very surprising or awing in any way. It's kind of just straightforward Julien Baker at this point, so it's something maybe I've heard before, really. Next track, Repeat. I can't say I dug it too much. The track is really starting to resemble a lot of the rest of the album by this point. There's a sort of like pattern of some reverby, clean guitar riffs guiding the track, a mid-tempo pace, and Julian vocals wailing for most of the track. I'm very meh on this track. I felt like it could have been left out on the cutting block if they had to trim it. Highlight reel. I thought this track was okay. It does improve as soon as there's some additional instrumentation material that comes in with a mobile and melodic bass line and so much needed rhythmic variation that's driven by the drums. Really wish this idea was pursued a bit more, because when those rhythmic elements drop out, the track can be a bit drab. Without those things, the track can just feel a bit bare with just Julian's vocals and some light keyboard chords and some ambient synths, but that's really all you get. It's an interesting track, but it could have been pursued in a much better fashion, I think. Next track, Zip Ties, the closing track. This track really bothered me. I felt like this album was a little bit more solid on the middle to, earlier front. And there's some potential all throughout, but this track, this ending track, really just didn't leave me feeling great. The track really is enveloped in like this slow tempo that is just screaming, please, let's just speed it up a bit. It really helps hit home on the despair, though, of this track, as the track just takes its time gorging itself in its sadness. It's very hopeless. You're just there taking it all in, and the track really isn't going anywhere else. It's dragging you towards this album's dreadful ending. If that's the track's intent, it definitely did a great job at that, but it doesn't really make the track that much more enjoyable. You're just left feeling with some despair, and I don't know, and some weird emotions, I guess, at the end of this album. I don't know. I just wish that the album didn't really end on that note, because there are some decent parts on this album, and some great potential, obviously, by the talented artist here, Julien Baker. Don't really know what to say. I think even though there are some criticisms here that I have, I think I dig it more than honestly Turn Out the Lights. I think the parts that make up here with the more rustic flavor, like on Heatwave, or even on parts where she really stands out, like Crying Wolf. Ringside was a nice moment as well as Favor. Tracks like those really helped make this track not feel totally abysmal, and they really made it, I guess, more interesting than some of her previous projects. I'll say that. But overall, I'm just very middle of the road with the album as a whole. 5 out of 10 if I had to rate it. I think maybe who'd be interested in this, if you're into Julien Baker at all, or if you're a Julien Baker fan, you're probably going to like this album. It's a curveball because she does deviate away from some of her more traditional stuff. So you might not like it if you're a traditionalist for her music in that sense. But if you're kind of just a casual Julien Baker listener, you're just into, listening to what's out there, give this album a shot. It might be 50-50. There's a good chance you might feel the way I do about it. But there's enough going on where I think most people can take a track or two and really dig those tracks at least. I'm still pretty interesting artist overall. I think there's a lot of potential there for Miss Julien Baker for whatever she wants to do. So I will be following whatever project she wants to do next, or maybe whether that is with Boy Genius or another interesting collab. I'd like to see her in the context of like a maybe a more traditional band where she's maybe like a member as the front person, or maybe like one of the rhythmic guitar players doing supporting vocals. I think she would definitely bring a band to another level in that context too. Or maybe she's not 100% on songwriter duties, but I don't know. That's just my 2 cents. Don't. That's my opinion as well. Don't take anything I say serious at all. I just like to talk about this stuff because, yeah, this is what this podcast is about. So, anyways, if you stuck with me to the end of this review, thanks for joining. Like I said, my name's Josh, and I'll be covering some more albums soon. Check out Best Orange Track of the Week if you're wanting to listen to more of what I have to say about other artists and stuff like that. Like and subscribe on YouTube. Leave some feedback, good or bad. Also subscribe on your desired podcast streaming service if you're on there too, listening just with audio. Appreciate you tuning in again. I'll see y'all later.